So you've heard this story before about a story we call the story of the Good Samaritan. And usually we talk about the Samaritan, and that's right. But today I want to talk about two other people in the story, the priest and the Levite. We don't talk about them so much. So the setting of the story is Jerusalem. On the outskirts of Jerusalem, you have one man leaving Jerusalem on his way to Jericho, and then two going into Jerusalem to worship, the priest and the Levite. So today I want to talk about the city of Jerusalem. Now, I know you've all heard the name Jerusalem, but I don't know if you know just how critical it is to the Hebrew people. It was their prized city. They called it their holy city. You've heard it called Zion or City of David. Jerusalem was their center of worship. Everything that happened around a festival, if it didn't happen in Jerusalem, it wasn't worth attending, and people would come from hundreds of miles around to worship in Jerusalem. It was the center of everything that was happening, especially when it came to worship. I want you to turn to the Old Testament so you get just a taste of how important Jerusalem is to the Hebrew people. David writes a psalm about Jerusalem. He writes a psalm about worshiping in Jerusalem. So this is Psalm 122. I'll start in verse 1. I rejoiced with those who said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem." Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. That is where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to praise the name of the Lord. Pray for the peace, or this word is shalom, peace with justice. Pray for the peace with justice of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. Verse 7, may there be peace with justice within your walls and security within your citadels. For the sake of my family and friends, I will say, peace be within you, Jerusalem. So I told you a couple of weeks ago that this name of the city, Jerusalem, means city of peace with justice, because the Jeru in it is city, and then you have Salem, which is a form of shalom. And shalom, sometimes we translate it just peace, but in essence, its truest meaning is peace with justice. And so Jerusalem is this city of peace with justice. And you have this story that Jesus tells of a man leaving. He gets beat down, and then you have a priest and a Levite walking past him. Just so you can put it in context, the priest is the professional Christian. He's like the pastor of our day. That's me and Jennifer Bellinger and Paul Gunther, and he walks by him on the other side of the road. And then you have the Levite. The Levite is the Christian that never misses church. The Levite grows up in church, literally. The Levite obviously went to Awana when he was 8, and then didn't miss a day of Sunday school or junior high ministry, and leads a small group, and is even there for Sunday night prayer. He's there all the time. That's the Levite. And the Levite passes on the other side. All right, so you have the priest and the Levite going to worship, and they walk past the man on the ground. Do you see the irony? And so it leads me to say this, and this is a thought that I want you to take home, is that you cannot separate worship from social justice. You cannot separate the ideas of worship in the Bible from justice. They go hand in hand, they go together. And so I have this key idea on the screen. It's in your handout. And I have a robust theology of worship, connects worship with justice. And God wants to use your life, your one and your very important life, to spread peace with justice in this city. I don't know if we always think of this as part of our God-given responsibility. Today I want to try to convince you of that. Do you see how the conversation, if you listened when Allie was reading, the conversation started with this. The theologian, the expert in the law says to Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "If you want into my kingdom, then you must pursue peace with justice. And you take care of people who are on the side of the road. That's my kind of people." If there is no justice in your worship, if there's no compassion in your worship, then your spirituality is incomplete. You see, when I talk about Christian spirituality in our country, in most churches, and for many Christians, I feel like we are very heavy on the side of personal morality. We understand that well. But I feel like we are feather light on the side of social justice. And maybe you've never made the connection between your spirituality and issues of justice. Today, I hope to show you. I'll start by answering this rhetorical question. What does social justice mean? What does it mean for a Christian to be passionate about those things? Social justice is the pursuit of balance in a society. It's the attempt to give a community, help it regain its moral equilibrium. It's when things are out of balance morally and we try to right the scales. Social justice means that I help the poorest of the poor and I try to pull them out of their poverty trap. To be passionate about social justice means that I am bothered to the very core by things that are unjust. I'm bothered to the very core by oppression, and I do all I can to stop it. To be for social justice means that I seek equality and equal treatment for all people. It's rooted in the idea of the Imago Dei in Genesis chapter 2, where God says, I've created every person in my image. And so because every person is created in God's image, they are equally, all people are worth equal dignity and respect and worth. And so we pursue that in the name of God. The thing is, often people in our communities around us are treated less than equal, and we just don't notice. I know that because I was living in a town and I didn't see what was happening. I told you I was a college pastor for about 7 years in Wheaton, Illinois. Wheaton, I've said is like Mayberry. And I was working with Wheaton college students, and we had a band that led our college ministry worship. And our drummer, we found this great drummer. He was a grad student at Wheaton. His name was Lincoln Douglas. And Lincoln, you have to picture, was just ripped guy, built like a linebacker. During the summer, he wore cut-off T-shirts all summer, and he had a faux hawk. So if you picture like Mr. T without the gold chains, that was Lincoln Douglas, all right? And Lincoln became a good friend. I knew him for a year, and then we traveled that summer. We took our band and a soccer team to Costa Rica, and then we went to Cuba. And in Cuba, we saw people living as one of different races and ethnicities like we had never seen before. When we went into worship in a church, there were people from, it seemed like, every continent on planet Earth. And so we were talking one night about issues of race in our country, and Lincoln says this. He says, in Wheaton, I'm treated different than the rest of you. And we said, get out of town, Lincoln. It's not like that. We all live there. He says, no, you don't understand. When I first moved to Wheaton from Trinidad and Tobago, he said, it felt like every week or every other week I was getting pulled over. And he says, really, it was because of the color of my skin. I hadn't even had a wrong lane change. All my lights were working, but I would get pulled over week after week after week. He said, so finally I got tired of it. So he said, I went down to the police station and I asked to see the police chief. I said, Lincoln, in a cutoff and your faux hawk, you're lucky they didn't taser you. And you go in looking like that. And the chief agreed to meet with him. And he sat down in his office. And Lincoln said he explained to the chief what was happening. And the chief was shaking his head. He said, I had no idea. And he said, I'm sorry, Lincoln. I'm sorry. He says, Lincoln, what can we do? What should we do? And Lincoln said, I think we should hold a diversity seminar right here in your police station, and I'll teach it. And the chief said, sure, let's do it this Saturday. And so they invited in all of the officers that had been pulling him over. And Lincoln gets up and leads a seminar. And they're floored that he's an intelligent, brilliant grad student that lives in our town. And you see, and Lincoln told them, this is what it's like for a black man to drive through Wheaton. And things started to change. I mean, that's the good news. My point is that we are called to pursue balance in our communities when we see it. The trouble is, and what's discouraging is, when I hear Christians say things like, well, I don't think the Bible says much about social justice. It just means they don't understand. when the Bible talks about these things. Jesus, for example, in Matthew 25. I've even had Christians say to me, stop saying that phrase, but it's in the Bible. Jesus in Matthew 25 says this. He says, for example, I was hungry and you fed me. Well, if someone is hungry and you feed them, that's a social issue. Jesus heals 10 lepers. If someone has a disease and you treat them and you help to heal them, that's a social issue. Jesus says, I was a foreigner and you invited me into your home. When you invite immigrants and foreigners into your home, that's a social issue. In the Old Testament, we have this great precedent set by writers like Isaiah. In Isaiah 58, Isaiah says this. He says, care for and feed the poor. And when Isaiah says care for and feed the poor, that's a social issue. Micah says the same thing. He says if you really want to please God, then pursue justice and stop the oppression. When you do that, that's a social issue. My point is that when the Bible talks about justice and equality, those are social issues, and we are called to have a passion for that. I have this thought. So why is social justice so important to the Christian? And I have several reasons, and you can write these down. I hope you take these thoughts home with you. First, I have God is disturbed by injustice, and he wants it stopped. The second thing is seeking justice on behalf of the oppressed is doable. We can make real change. And then here's the kicker. You are part of God's plan. I'm going to say you are critical and central to God's plan for ending injustice and oppression in this city. And so as you leave here, before you leave here today, I hope you grab onto this idea that this is part of your God-given calling. As you think about these things, I hope you're asking the question, so what is my responsibility to creating a more just society, a more just community where I live? I want to talk about Jesus' challenge to be a neighbor. I think there's several things he says about neighbors that we usually don't say in church. The first is this: when your neighbor is in trouble, go to your neighbor. Stop standing at a distance. And so let's turn in our Bibles to Luke chapter 10, and let me read to you verse 34. In verse 34, we see this: going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. And so his neighbor, I underline this language, going over to him. You can't beat that. Sometimes we stand at a distance. Sometimes we ignore the problems. Sometimes we act like people have created their own problems. But Jesus says he goes over to him. Seeing and acknowledging the trouble in neighborhoods or in your neighbor's life around you is the first thing, to see and acknowledge it. We read here, too, of the priest and the Levite. We read this: by chance a Jewish priest came along, and when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side. So he sees him, but he doesn't acknowledge that there's a problem. He just says, it's not my problem. And he keeps going. And Jesus says, and this kind of person is not fit for my kind of kingdom. And so often we deny that the issues are real. We stand at a distance, and Jesus wants to change that. He wants us to go and be one with our neighbors. Hear me out on what I want to say next, because I think there's something there we need to grab onto. About a year ago, there was a community in St. Louis, a neighborhood in St. Louis, where people started to walk together and march together every day. This went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It went on for 100 days. About 2 months in, I called a friend of mine and who lives in St. Louis. He lives, in fact, in a suburb really close to this neighborhood. And I said, so have you been over there yet to walk with him? And he goes, no, I haven't thought much about that. I said, well, have the pastors from your church gone to walk with their pastors? And he says, no, Palmer, you know they wouldn't do that. You see, I've been to his church. It has nice white columns and a brick facade and a white steeple on top. I said, no, I really didn't know they wouldn't do that. I said, well, at least have they prayed about for these people? Have they prayed about what's happening there? Have they said much? He says, no, they haven't said anything on Sundays. So I just want you to picture this. In one city, you have people of a community carrying signs that say things like, we feel like our lives do not matter. They're carrying signs that say things like, there is no justice and there is no peace in our city. All right, so they're in one neighborhood. And then in the neighborhood next door, you have people driving to church and singing songs about God and reading Bible verses about God and praying to God, but never saying or doing anything for their neighbors one neighborhood over. Do you see the inconsistency? Do you see why we cannot separate justice from worship? Do you see even it's practically hypocrisy to go and worship God and ignore the things that are happening in a neighborhood close to us? That's why Jesus says, go to your neighbor. Going to the Samaritan, he soothes his wound. I think every day as you drive the streets of our city and of our town, you have the opportunities to intervene and to stop things that are not right. Maybe you have never made the connection in your life between worship and justice. Today, I hope you do. Because like I said before, you cannot separate issues of justice from worship. Because God wants peace with justice in our worship. This is a very biblical idea. It goes back to Isaiah chapter 58. In Isaiah 58, let me read to you what happens here. So the people are worshiping God, and God says your worship isn't working anymore because you're ignoring what's happening around you. Isaiah 58, verse 5. And this is God speaking to Isaiah. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only in a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? Is that acceptable? He's saying, you do all of these acts of worship, but it's incomplete. And then he says this is the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke to set the oppressed free. Micah describes the same tension. He talks about people bringing offerings and acts of worship to God. And then he says this is Micah chapter 6, verse 7. Would God be impressed with thousands of rams, with buckets and barrels of olive oil? Would he be moved if I sacrificed my firstborn child, my precious baby, to cancel my sin? And he says, no, he's already made it plain how to live and what to do. What God is looking for in men and women is quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love. Do you see what God wants? He says all of these acts of worship, they're good, but they're not enough if you don't care about the poor and the oppressed and the injustice that's around you. So Jesus continues. Let's pick up his story, verse 33. But a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw him, he felt deep pity, and he went over to him. Jesus is saying, this is my kind of person. I think my challenge is to stop standing at a distance. If you see an issue of injustice or inequality in your workplace or in your neighborhood or in a school or in your community, we must take steps to stop it. I would say this. I would say, ask God, pray in the morning, God, show me the divine interruptions you want me to get involved with. I think we should all live more like Sergio Consuega. I have a picture of him here. What happened is Sergio, he lives in New York City, and he happened to come upon the most tragic scene. This is about a year and a half ago. Some motorcycle guys had stopped a family in their car at a stoplight. They felt they had cut him off, and they were angry. I won't get into the whole story, but they broke the window of this SUV and pulled the driver out. His name is Alex Lean. And they're beating him over the head with their helmets, and other guys are trying to pull his wife out of the back seat. She's there with her baby. And Sergio Consuega sees what's happening. So he walks over and he stands over Alex Lean and he says, stop, enough. Now you have to look at his left hand. In his left hand, he says, I was holding my notebook. He says, that's what I take to church to take notes in. He's got his notebook and his Bible. he's on his way to church. And so Sergio Consuega is on his way to worship, and he stops a tragedy. I think every day in our city, every day that you work, there's opportunities for you to intervene in issues that are not right and just say, God, show me the divine interruptions you have for me. I'll say this next. Let's go back to verse 34. I'll say, pick up your neighbor. So we read this. Having come near, I'm going to read this from the Young's literal translation, and so it's kind of almost word for word from the Greek. Having come near, he bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then having lifted him up onto his own beast. I don't know why Young uses that word, but he says he puts him on his beast. So picture this. He treats him, and then he lifts him up. One of our great God-given responsibilities is for us to pick up and lift up the least and the last and give them the dignity that God sees in them. We read this in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8. He lifts up the poor from the dust and the needy from the garbage dump. He sets them among princes, placing them in seats of honor. You know, so my question is, what are you doing in our community and in our city to lift up the least and the last and to give them dignity and respect? So there's a woman who lives in Minnesota. Her name, you've never heard of her. Her name is Kathy Hayes. And Kathy Hayes had been a social worker for many years. And Kathy Hayes said she noticed something among the poorest of the poor in Minneapolis. She noticed that many of them were poor and could not hold a job because of their cars. She said their cars were constantly breaking down on the side of the road. And when your car breaks down on the side of the road, you can't make it to work. You can't get your toddler to preschool. You can't even get to the city transportation trying to get into town. So she quit her job. And this is a picture of her here. And she opens a garage. Who does that? She knew nothing about mechanics, but she said they needed a mechanic in that community. So I went and learned. And she opened her garage. Do you want to hear the name of the garage? It's called the Lift Garage. How do you like that? And she says, we're lifting people up out of their poverty trap. And how biblical is that? And here's the thing with the Lift Garage. She hires people in the neighborhood, but they only charge you for exactly what the part costs. You pay for that, and then their hourly rate is $15 an hour. I think I pay like $150 an hour around here. I need to find a Lift Garage myself. But do you see how she's helping to lift up the least? And it's a very biblical thing, and that's what Jesus is showing us a picture of. And then he does this. The man walks with his neighbor. Verse 34, he walked along beside him. It doesn't seem like a big deal to you, does it? But Jerusalem was a very divided city. And in this divided city, they were divided between race and ethnicity and nationality and language. And especially the Jews and the Samaritans in Jerusalem were divided. Do you know how much they despised the Samaritans? So much so that if the shadow of a Samaritan touched a Hebrew person, they were considered unclean. And now we read that this person, that this Samaritan is walking with the man, and they're walking together. If you want peace with justice to spread in our city, then we must start walking with our neighbors in their times of trouble. We must find solidarity and oneness with them in their most desperate times of trouble. We see this in the Old Testament. We see a great example of this in Moses. So most of you know that Moses came upon a burning bush, right? And when he sees the bush burning, he drops to his knees and he drops to his face on the ground. And why does he do that? He drops to his face and he drops on the ground to worship God. And then God says this. You know what the first thing God tells him? He says, take off your shoes. And you go, why would he tell him to take off his shoes? Because when you take off your shoes, for the Hebrew person, it's called yahef. Yahef means to be dispossessed. It means barefoot. It means I'm barefoot. Yahef means that. But it also means dispossessed. And so he's worshiping dispossessed, and God is saying, now go to my people who are in slavery. So the Hebrew people are literally working in Egypt in slavery barefoot. They've been dispossessed of their land. They've been dispossessed of their dignity. And now he says to Moses, if you're going to go and serve among them, you must be Yahweh. You must be dispossessed too and find solidarity and oneness. So do you see how while he's worshiping, he becomes the dispossessed one and he becomes one with the least and the last. That's Moses' story. I think what Jesus was trying to get people with his story to do was to change their attitudes and their biases in Jerusalem. Like I said, Jerusalem was a city that was thick with prejudice and bigotry and discrimination, and Jesus is trying to change that. And he's saying, walk together, take care of each other in their trouble, be there in their most desperate time. Do you know what I loved hearing? This is after the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina. So, just a matter of weeks ago, 9 people were killed in church. A number of men and women, some were pastors, and they're shot to death. That was on a Wednesday night. On Sunday morning, I didn't know this was going to happen. Many, if not most, of the churches in the Charleston area, especially those close to downtown, they canceled church in their churches. And they told all of their people, instead of worshiping separately this week, we're all going to the Mother Emanuel AME Church, and we're going to worship there as one. And so you had people from all denominations and all churches coming together, literally thousands of them. So many came to AME Emanuel Church on that Sunday. They couldn't even fit them in the door, and they gathered outside, and they worshiped as one. When your neighbor is in trouble, when your neighbor is going through the darkest times, then Jesus says, walk with them. I have one last thought I want to share with you this morning, and it's a very simple one, and it's this: do life together. Do life with your neighbor, and when you do that, peace with justice spreads. Verse 37, so the lawyer, he says, he's talking to this lawyer, to this man of the religious law, and he says, go and do the same. So Jesus had asked the man, who is the neighbor? Who's the real neighbor here? And this man of the religious law despises the Samaritan so much, he won't even say the Samaritan. He says, well, the one who went to his neighbor, that's the one. And he gets the answer right. Do you know what the issue was? One of the great issues in Jerusalem when Jesus was there was stereotyping. Most of the prejudices and the discrimination came out of the stereotyping. And so Jesus is trying to break this down. If we look at our own lives, and if we're honest, I think in all of our lives to some degree there's been stereotyping. And I want to say there's only one thing that can end that, because stereotyping goes hand in hand with racism. But there's only one thing that can end the stereotyping. It's authentic, genuine relationships. When you go to your neighbor and you truly become a friend of your neighbor, and you do life with your neighbor, and you have dinner with your neighbor, and you watch football games together with your neighbor, and you barbecue in the backyard with your neighbor, then all of those stereotypes start to dissolve and go away. And so my challenge to you is to pursue authentic, genuine relationships with your neighbors, especially the ones who are different from you in any way. There's a true story of Billy Graham starting his crusades back in the 1950s. And one of the first crusades that Billy Graham held, well, they were all in tents, but his people had set up a tent, and this was in the Los Angeles area. And Billy Graham showed up a little early for the night's event, and he saw ropes running through the tent. And he asked his staff, he said, what are the ropes for? And they said, well, it's to divide the races. He said, what? He says, no, not in God's place of worship. And so he went through the tent, and Billy Graham himself took the ropes down. He took the barriers down. And it led him to say his famous line, the ground at the foot of the cross is level. The ground at the foot of the cross is level. And it's just not for when we come to church together, but it's how we live life every day. The ground that the Christian walks on is level. And so I'd simply end by asking you, What barriers are dividing people in your neighborhood? What is between you and your neighbor? And whatever it is, whatever comes to mind, can I say, start taking those barriers down? That's my challenge. You are God's plan for spreading peace with justice in this city. Thank you for listening and taking this to heart this morning.